Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a little early on the last day, so glad to see so many people. I think it's a little bit of a sick joke from Niall and Daria to have a talk that says unified theory of SRE after 6 to 7 SRE talks that all have a different theory of what SRE is. But I mean, like, hey, it's great to have that dialogue back and forth. So when writing this talk, or writing the CFP for this talk, you kind of, for those of you who haven't submitted a CFP before, you have all this hubris. You're like, ooh, I'm gonna figure it out. And part of that energy that I was trying to channel in originally was from in the 20th century, there were a bunch of really famous physics conferences. I believe the name was Solvay Conference. So this is a picture from 1927. The first one is 1911. And it was basically all the invite-only top physicists of the era were coming together to solve the hard problems, right? And I'm writing the CFP being like, SREcon is the Solvay Conference. In reality, feels a little bit different, right? When you come here, you're kind of you open Twitter, you're oh God, no, put that away. You hear all these different talks of what are we doing with our lives? And it feels definitely more chaotic. And I think in 100 years, let's say, right, when people are looking back of what was SREcon like, they might use this. But don't be too sad because that pizza box was filled with VC cash. So not all that bad. Which we're setting on fire, that's right. All right, so sort of story time about what catalyzed this talk, because this talk is really a little bit about my loss of faith in SRE as we knew it. So a couple years ago, I had a call with an engineering director from a German company. And I remember them telling me how they had 2 infrastructure engineers working for them. And in Germany, there are lots of workers' rights, which is weird for somebody coming from North America, but it sounds great. So some of those rights include when you are on call, that is considered working hours. If you are working and you stop working, you are legally given an 11-hour break between the next time you start working. Sundays are weird. I don't understand it, but go and find a German and they'll explain it. And also, there's sort of specific law around how many hours you can be working, including on-call time, over a given span of multiple weeks. And this director was telling me about how if somebody gets paged, right, or somebody goes finishes their shift, and the next person gets paged, they can't do any swapping. And in certain situations, they legally can't put a new person on call because they haven't met their defined mandated break between. And he's like, what do I do? And I remember being on the call being like, I have no idea. And from that conversation, I remember being like, wait a second, we haven't gotten it all figured out? Because I was this sweet summer child back then. I was like, you know what? There's always an answer to all the questions. And here was a very real company. They were making money, but they only had 2 infrastructure engineers. That's all they could afford. What do they do? And so I guess as we're unraveling this, it's important that we get to the same context about maybe the story of how we got to where we are today, the history of it. So let's go back in time and look at sort of what happened. So in 2003, Ben Traynor joined Google, was in charge of the operations team and was like, I don't like this, we're gonna do SRE, right? And there's a talk, referenced in the bottom there from SREcon2014 that kind of goes into the story of what his vision was for SRE back then. Pedro's talk from SREcon2015, Pedro's the director of production engineering at Facebook, he talks about how in 2009 they already had SRE. It wasn't quite clear when they went from an operations to an SRE model, but what it sounded like from the talk is they saw SRE at Google and they're like, that sounds great. They made it, they tried to bring that over to Facebook, and it wasn't really working. I mean, this was a really rough time for Facebook. They were scaling 3x, SRE team was struggling. So what do you do when you can't nail down your infrastructure like SRE? You split the team up and you do a reorg. So they decided to split out SRE into 2 teams, into AppOps, which is application operations, which for them was people embedded into teams, into product teams, to keep the systems running. And then they had SROs, site reliability operations, which kind of sounds like what SRE would be. So their role was to keep the site up, focus on automation and capacity. And they kind of took over from that SRE role. Honestly, I wish I was at 2015 so I can ask a bunch of questions about this, like go back in time. So in 2012, they decided to rename app operations to production engineering, to drop the word operations from the title. The hope that over time people will forget about the operations title. It's kind of funny because we talk a lot about like titles, like don't just change the title, but Pedro in this talk was very much arguing like, no, titles have a really big impact, which is sort of an interesting perspective. I think the important part though to think about is like production engineering was only embedded SRE essentially. Then in 2014, SREs phased out at Facebook. The way he talked about it was kind of like, we were done, like we finished. They had built a lot out their like infrastructure and monitoring tooling, but it got too big for just that organization to manage it. So they were kind of like, all engineering teams must figure out their own operations. And the struggle kind of became, how do you make sure the production engineers just don't take up all this load? 2014, the first SREcon in Santa Clara. I think for our history, SREcon is actually very important context because without it, I'm not sure we would have gone in as big as it really has, right? Like SREcon has really been a driving force of pushing out the thoughts we talk about here. And then finally, the SRE book is released. I mean, like, what hasn't been said about this? Most of us have read this book, probably all of us. Like, this has really been, like, once this book came out in 2016, it was really like almost like scaling like crazy for the SRE community itself, right? So let's talk about the book. Oh, different Bible. I want to put into context how we got to where we are as an industry today, because I think a lot of it hinges on this book. So the book had 70 contributors. Out of curiosity, show of hands of who here works in an SRE org that has less than 70 people in it. Interesting, right? It has dozens of teams, right? Dozens of team views. And if you go and talk to people, and I think this has even been mentioned publicly in talks and blog posts and whatnot, when those chapters were written, they went to the best team that did on-call and asked them to write a chapter. They went to the best team that did database operations and asked them to put in a chapter. So if you went to every team in your organization and asked them to write about the best thing that's happening on that team, you put it into a book and you release that book. Do you think that's an honest perspective of what it's like to work at your organization? And then this number. Yesterday at the end of Hidalgo's talk, he mentioned that in 2014, the number of SREs, so I guess this is almost like a quiz if people were listening. Does anyone want to venture a guess on how many SREs there were at the time of publishing the SRE book? You can shout it out if you have a guess. Really? Wait, come on. I need at least one number. 1,200. Can you tell Niall used to work at Google? 1,200 SREs. So when Google released the book in 2016, right? Not 2022, 2016, 1,200 SREs. But that's not it, right? Like this is the part when I was like digging into this, like it's not just 1,200. So when you read the book, when I read the book, and I think when most people were reading the book, you were like, oh, SRE at Google, infrastructure, right. So it's like there's an SRE department, there's like a network SRE, a storage SRE team, and that's the like SRE org, right? And beside the SRE org, you might have like the product team and the support team, but the SRE org is the one that manages the infrastructure. And you'd be wrong, because the SRE org is not that. The SRE org ladders into the infrastructure org. Beside the SRE org is a whole other software suite org where people would build the infrastructure tools that the SRE org was working with, right? The SRE org would build their own tooling as well, but a lot of the like cool technology infrastructure stuff we hear from Google, that was a different org. All right, 1,200 SREs, right? At least 1,200 SWEs. Like 2,400 engineers in this organization? Like, how many companies on the planet have 2,400 engineers? The way I can think about this, and like how I've sort of been trying to like, when Google engineers leave Google, they must feel like aliens, right? Like visiting planet Earth and looking around at what we're doing and just going like, holy shit, what the fuck is Terraform? We need to get out of here. And this leads me to sort of think that like the foundations that SRE is built upon has cracks. I mean, I would even go as far to say, I think our foundation is corrupted. Because the viewpoint that this book provided to us is like, it comes from a perspective that is so far away from most of us. It's not like, you can't even conceive of 2,500 people, right? Like, 1,200 people is if you took everyone who was attending this SREcon and everyone online, and you doubled that, that's not 1,200 SREs, right? So we're talking about 4x this conference of SREs in 2016. And then we took all of these strategies for running services at massive organizations, and with a little bit of polishing, we tried to spread it across the industry. If it worked for us, it'll work for you. And I mean, I think there's one of the benefits of sort of being towards the end of the conference is you can kind of sort of like see what the conversation has been in the hallway track and some of the talks. And I think Laura's keynote earlier when she said Google should give us an apology at some point, I think is quite accurate. Because I've heard from some people this weekend that like, oh, the SRE book was aspirational, right? Like, you shouldn't have taken it for gospel. We don't do everything from this book. It's more of like a guidepost. I remember when the book came out. Like, that was not how it wasn't like, give it a try. It was like, here's the authoritative text of SRE. If you would like to do SRE, read this book and figure it out. And now, as we're sort of beginning to see the cracks, it's like, no, don't take it as an authoritative text. Google, I've made SREs. Oh, you fucked up a perfectly good programmer is what you did. Look at it, it's got anxiety. I think Google gave it a shot, and in this talk, for the rest of it, I think I'd like to take a stab at reformulating what SRE looks like for startups, especially now that we have the appropriate context, that a lot of the principles and foundations our ideas have been built on and discussed about don't apply, right? So to start, when I'm going to be talking about SRE, I'm going to be talking about a single organization that handles infrastructure for the entire company, right? I feel like this is probably similar to what most of us are running, and you can call it whatever you want. That's where I'm landing at, right? Like, if it's SRE, if it's platform DevOps infrastructure, it doesn't really matter. I feel like the ethos of SREcon is how do we operate our systems reliably? And getting into the sort of like the pedantics of like what these different practices means have kind of been obscuring more valuable discussions that we could be having. So startups versus real businesses. When I'm talking about startups, I'm talking about this idea of default dead versus default alive. So for those of you who aren't familiar in sort of like startup nomenclature, there's this idea of like default dead versus default alive. So in default alive, if product development stops, you take your hands off the keyboard, you're not doing any sort of additional marketing, will the company survive next month? Is it on trend to keep going, or will it run out of money? So default alive is you can take your hands off the keyboard, go for a very nice long vacation, your company will still survive, right? Default dead is if you don't figure something out, if you don't find product market fit, if you don't know how to cut costs somewhere, do something different, if you don't raise more money, your company will cease to exist. Usually it's like 18 months, right? When you raise a round, it's until 18 months, and then you have to like raise a new round or figure something out. So it's 18 months or less. And that's a really sort of, I think, important grounding for us in this conversation, because with real businesses, we can kind of assume that you have customers. You have customers you can SRE. And focusing on the reliability for those customers, and I think we can stretch the definition here of what reliability means, right? We can go performance, availability, reliability. You can justify the existence of this organization, right? Like you can say, hey, we're actually saving customers, we're improving the experience, give us budget to run this organization. For startups, if you don't have any customers, what are you doing? And I mean, we have a bunch of vendors, right, out in the sponsor hall. A lot of them have SREs. A lot of them haven't found product market fit. So, I mean, it's not like we don't have SREs at startups, but there's this tension. So I'm going to be saying that I think startups, the only thing that matters is product velocity. That's it. So the most important thing you can be doing in this case is increasing velocity. Essentially, that means your work goes from focusing on production to focusing on developer infrastructure. So that means developer environments, integration testing, staging, CI systems, deploys. The only thing that matters is how do you accelerate the product team to find that product market fit so the company can keep existing. Because reliability doesn't matter if your company won't be around in 6 months. If that means your product team needs to get a feature out now, you need to help them optimize it for it. It also means doing the bare minimum for production work to get it running, right? And what that means is no Kubernetes, right? Like this focus on Kubernetes is a distraction. The only thing that matters is accelerating your developer's ability to release features. So like, does this go too far? And I think there's a bit of sort of a regulator for this, and it's future-proofing. So certain classes of infrastructure work get really painful over time to implement. And there's the sorts of things that are like, before you have users, it's easy to get it working. Maybe like a good example would be like DNSSEC, where it's like high risk when you have customers. When you don't, you can kind of just like play with it until it works. The really common ones that everyone here has dealt with is like network and VPC design in the cloud, right? Or like IAM and authentication. And so it's not like completely forget about production, but there's this like bare minimum investment that you don't hate your life in the future, but you might not have a future if you're not investing in the velocity. And the crux and the difficulty here is how do you know when you're future-proofing or over-engineering? So technology. I think we don't talk enough about technology at SREcon, which is weird. Like, you don't hire without talking about technology when you're hiring an SRE into your team, right? Like, you interview to find out their technical skills. And we're kind of just like, don't worry about that. It doesn't matter about the underlying tech. We can like process it to reliability. I'm not sure I'm convinced about that. And I think the other thing that I've sort of has been getting at me watching like our community as we've been going has been this idea that like we're always trying to operate at the edge of technology, right? Like we're always trying to go for this idea of just like, oh, we need the latest and greatest thing. And in reality, most of us don't. Very few of us are doing something brand new, right? Like a lot of us, it's like we're finding a new business case. It might be a different shape, but we're not operating like 17 regions with multiple data centers. I remember Meta talking about how they have these like massive deployments up to 1 million servers in each region. That's not our problems, right? Like we don't have those sets of problems. So we should stop pretending we do, and that like spot where most of us operate, it's actually kind of nice. The other point here is this might be, what's I'm looking for? Like a little, I'm blanking on the word, but like we pretty much all operate the same thing. And I know you're probably sitting there going like, maybe everyone else has like crappy web apps, but my thing is unique and special and needs this like custom controller. Is it? I think at SREcon, if we're going to have this conference be about operating systems at scale, we should be standardizing our designs as a community. All of us have to set up VPCs, all of us have to set up IAM. Why don't we have the standard, right? Like, we have all the minds and the sort of like brain power here to be putting these together, and we're not. And then finally, which kind of goes back to the last graph of use boring technology that doesn't cost any innovation tokens. I can't explain it any better than the boringtechnology.club at the bottom. So if you're not familiar with innovation tokens, I highly encourage you to go and check out that link. I'll probably post it in the Slack afterwards. It basically talks about a very high level, unless the technology you're using is giving you a business advantage, you're wasting time, right? That is sort of a waste of an innovation token, and you should be putting your resources for whatever this problem is towards something that's a standard solution that everyone uses. Boring technology means no Kubernetes. So service level objectives. I think it's difficult to make a compelling argument for SLOs at startups. If your SLOs stay relevant, you need to come back to the velocity component and accelerate it. We're talking about a situation here where your company's not going to exist in 18 months, right? Or less. So thinking about sort of like, what is this right level of service we're providing? In my opinion, it might be a waste of time. And from talking to a lot of people at the conference and so on, a lot of startups don't have SLOs. They're like, we should, but we don't. We're focusing on other things. And that's the other important one is when your velocity is really high, what you believe currently matters should be changing, right? Because otherwise, if you're not sort of learning with this velocity, you should go and focus on that. But if you're constantly learning, then the things that matter evolve. So anything in this, like today, that you set as your SLO or whatever you think is super important might shift in a month or so. And constantly doing this exercise of establishing this might not be the best use of time. So what do we do instead? I think the underlying ideas behind SLOs are quite valuable. This idea of think through what is important for your customers from your service. And this could be at a very high level, but having some of those principles embedded and having talked about can last a very long time. So what I've seen this called before has been this idea of like an infrastructure constitution or like axioms. And the idea here is like establish your principles of how you want the infrastructure to behave, right? Like for some situations, it's better for you to serve stale data versus returning an error. So you'll know that in the future, if you're designing a particular part of the system, if you prefer to be available and serving stale data, like that's what you will lean towards. The other one is sort of like, I feel like this one is quite interesting and relevant for a lot of us of like, would you rather be down for many small customers or one big one? And at this sort of size, these are important questions because that then goes back to that future-proofing work of like, you still have this principled thought in the back of your head. And the hope is that it lasts way longer. Incident reviews. So incident reviews in the SRE book, and I think often how we've talked about it, we're getting into a better place now, but it's always, or not always, but very often it's been geared towards massive organizations that have a bunch of bureaucracy and competing forces for getting that work done. And so talking about like, let's say like action items and whatnot, at a startup where you're moving really, really quickly, is that the best use of your time? The thing is though, is it's like, I'm not convinced that the solution is screw incident reviews. I think there's some sort of middle ground of how can you get like the 80% value from an incident and then not spend any more time than necessary on the rest of it because your system is changing so quickly. is every incident worth learning from? I felt a little sort of like, ooh, am I going to get kicked out of this conference for putting this on a slide? And then as I was thinking about it, it's like we intuitively decide that all bugs don't deserve incident reports. So we're already saying the answer is no, right? Because otherwise we'd say every small bug needs an incident report. So if you sort of take that concept of how you operate today and start scaling it down towards smaller companies, do bugs get bigger? Is there like a small class of incidents that you're like, hey, screw it, this isn't worth it? I don't know where that line is, but I feel like that would be an interesting dialogue for us to start having. And then on-call. What does a healthy on-call look like when you can't put enough engineers on a pager? If you've worked at a startup that has, let's say, 5, 8, 10 engineers, this becomes like a very weird, like head-scratchy moment, because you start asking yourself of like, you start doing that for like, okay, if we're like doing these like 24/7 rotations, you just don't have enough people to make it sustainable. But then, especially for me, when I was coming to a startup, it was kind of like, but you need 24/7 availability for your service. What do you do? Like, do you just have like a 9 to 5 pager? Do you only do it at specific hours for the service? Service dependent, but I feel like pulling back this onion would be very interesting for us to talk about. And that's the end of the talk.